It is a strange paradox of the modern world that the most obvious economic stories, the ones we accept as default reality, are often the very same ones that have demonstrably failed us. Even when the outcomes of these systems shatter, the stories themselves self-repair, becoming the invisible infrastructure we use to navigate the wreckage. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It really is great to be here. And our mission for today's deep dive is, well, it's incredibly specific and honestly a bit daunting.
Yeah.
We're going to conduct a systems-level institutional analysis of how narratives are manufactured, distributed, and absorbed.
Right, because we aren't just talking about, basic PR or spin.
Exactly. No, we are looking at how stories are effectively converted into a shared physical reality for voters, for financial markets, the media, the whole institutional framework.
The actual machinery.
The structural machinery, yes. The design, the incentives, the outcomes, and crucially, the persistence of these narratives. How they pre-package our political and economic choices so we feel perfectly rational and free even when we're operating inside a highly controlled environment.
And the foundational ideas guiding us today come from Andrew Blackwood's work, Social Capitalism, the end of Neo-Liberalism and where we go next. It's this deeply researched look into our information and ideology regime. We're putting a magnifying glass right on the intersection of modern politics, economics, and human psychology.
It's a heavy text.
It is. And before we get into the mechanisms of all this, I need to explicitly outline a ground rule for this deep dive.
Please do, yeah.
Because the underlying research and the structural examples we're discussing today, they contain some highly politically charged elements.
They do.
We're talking about both left-wing and right-wing political figures, parties, platforms. We'll be looking at dynamics between the Labour and Conservative parties in the UK, Republican and Democrat dynamics in the US, and specific figures like Donald Trump. So I must directly tell you, the listener, that neither of us here is taking a side. We are not endorsing these viewpoints or rendering any moral judgments whatsoever. We are strictly imparting the structural examples contained in the source material to analyze the underlying system.
Yes.
Our goal is to look at the machinery itself, not to endorse or condemn the output of that machinery.
That is such a crucial distinction to make right at the top. We're basically observing the factory floor of ideology,
Right.
regardless of which partisan brand is currently rolling off the assembly line. When a mechanic looks at a broken engine, they don't judge the engine for breaking down.
So just figure out why it broke.
Exactly. They map the inputs, the friction points, the predictable failures. That's our approach today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the design of the system itself. How do these narratives actually take root?
Well, the overarching analysis in the text relies on this brilliant conceptual framework that goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
Plato's cave.
Plato's case, exactly. For anyone who might be rusty on their Philosophy 101, Plato describes this group of prisoners chained inside a cave, and they're facing a blank wall.
Just staring straight ahead.
Right. And behind them is a roaring fire. Various objects are passed in front of that fire, which casts these two-dimensional shadows onto the wall they're facing.
And because they've been chained there their entire lives.
They genuinely believe those flickering shadows are authentic, three-dimensional reality that is the world to them.
Right, and the traditional takeaway from that allegory is always that if a prisoner somehow escapes, climbs out of the cave, sees the real objects under the actual sun, they achieve enlightenment.
They see the truth, and they pity the people still looking at the shadows.
Exactly. But here is the brilliant and honestly slightly terrifying modern twist on that concept that Blackwood brings up. In today's world, you might actually prefer the reflected images and the shadows.
You might actively choose them.
Yes. If you escape the cave today, you might take one look at the sun, find it entirely too bright, too chaotic, and just willingly walk right back down into the dark.
Because you like the shapes of the shadows on the wall.
You like their predictable movements? You prefer the shadows because they perfectly suit your pre-existing worldview. It's a completely customized, comfortable reality.
Which is a profound shift in how we usually understand human motivation. I mean, we often assume everyone naturally wants the objective truth.
We like to think we do, anyway.
Right. But what if the objective truth is socially alienating or just cognitively exhausting? What's fascinating here is how that preference for the customized shadow over the complex real object becomes so deeply internalized.
And to understand that internalization, we have to look at T.E. Halm.
Yes, the early 20th century thinker. Halm made this incredible observation that certain doctrines or prevailing ideologies aren't actually viewed by the general public as opinions at all.
Wait, let me stop you there. If they aren't opinions, what are they?
He called them inevitable categories of the human mind.
Inevitable categories.
Right. These ideas sit so far back in our consciousness that we don't look at them. We look through them.
They're the lens itself.
Exactly. Think about it like a pair of rose-tinted glasses you've worn since you were a toddler.
Yeah.
Because you've never taken them off, you don't realize you're wearing pink lenses.
You just look around and assume the world is inherently objectively pink.
And if someone comes along and says, actually, the world isn't pink, you're just wearing glasses, you wouldn't think they were offering a different perspective. You'd think they were insane.
That is such a powerful analogy, and it perfectly mirrors Elaine de Botton's concept of how ideology functions in our modern era, which is heavily referenced here.
The odorless gas.
Yes. De Botton argues that true, deeply entrenched ideology doesn't announce itself. It's not this heavy, oppressive rulebook handed down by a dictator that you're forced to memorize. Instead, he describes it as a colorless, odorless gas.
It's just ambient.
It's embedded everywhere in the environment. It's in the newspapers you read, the television programs you casually stream.
The advertisements flashing on your screen.
Exactly. Even the textbooks in our elementary schools. It creates a default reality without ever showing its work.
And the absolute genius of this colorless, odorless gas is that it makes light of its own partiality. It never says, hey, here's a highly contested economic theory.
Right. It just meekly implies that it's stating age-old, obvious, common-sense truths.
This is just how the world works. And the enforcement mechanism for this isn't the secret police. It's not authoritarian. The mechanism is entirely social.
Because if this ideology is an obvious truth, then anyone who disagrees with it must be a fool.
A fool, a fanatic, a maniac.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Isn't it possible that some things actually are just obvious truths? I mean, we need some baseline consensus to function as a society, right?
Sure.
If I say the sky is blue, I'm not pumping an odorless gas into the room. I'm just stating a fact. Why is it a crisis that we share common assumptions?
That is the exact defense the system uses to protect itself. Yes, the sky is blue. That is an empirically verifiable physical reality.
Right?
But what the ideological regime does is take highly complex human-made structural choices, like how we distribute wealth, how we regulate corporations, or how we define a successful economy, and it dresses them up in the exact same clothes as the sky is blue.
Ah, okay.
The crisis occurs when we mistake a constructed policy choice for a law of physics. When we do that, we lose the ability to even imagine alternatives, let alone debate them.
I see. It's the camouflage of common sense. But how does this gas actually get absorbed by you and me on an individual level? How does our physical brain process this?
This brings us to the cognitive mechanics of belief.
Specifically, the groundbreaking work of Daniel Kahneman.
Yes, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist.
Yeah.
And his concepts of System 1 and System 2 thinking.
This is where the structural really meets the biological.
Exactly. Kahneman outlines that we effectively have two operating systems in our brains. System 1 is our fast, automatic, intuitive, and deeply emotional mode.
It's
instantaneous, with no conscious effort. Then you have System 2, which is the slower, more deliberative, logical, analytical mode.
right.
Now, our brains are incredibly energy-intensive organs. They consume a disproportionate amount of our daily calories. So, purely as a biological survival mechanism to conserve energy, we default to System 1 whenever possible. We rely heavily on heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Exactly.
And the most powerful heuristic Kahneman identifies in this political and economic context is cognitive ease.
Yes.
I want you, the listener, to really consider how this operates in your day-to-day life, especially when you consume news. Imagine you're lying in bed at 11 p.m. You're scrolling through your social media feed. You are tired.
Your brain is winding down.
Exactly. And you see a headline about a politician you already dislike, and the headline says they did something corrupt or foolish. Because that headline perfectly aligns with the beliefs you already hold, your brain experiences a rush of cognitive ease.
It feels comfortable.
It feels familiar. There is zero friction. Kahneman's research shows that when a conclusion feels familiar and comfortable like that, System 1 takes the wheel completely. You are highly likely to accept incredibly unsound, poorly sourced arguments as long as they support that conclusion. If it feels comfortable, your brain just tags it as true.
Precisely. You don't engage system 2, you don't click the link, you don't trace the primary source, or check the methodology of the polling data, or look for conflicts of interest.
Because your brain says, hey, this matches our existing map of the world perfectly. There is absolutely no need to burn precious metabolic calories analyzing it.
You just hit like or share and move on.
But if you see a headline that contradicts your worldview,
The exact opposite happens. It creates cognitive strain. Suddenly, the mental friction is high. System 2 is violently jolted awake, and suddenly you are vigilant,
you're suspicious.
highly critical of the incoming data. You'll demand an impossibly high burden of proof, often finding any minor grammatical error or tiny methodological flaw and a valid excuse to reject the entire piece of information.
So this biological preference for cognitive ease is essentially the incredibly fertile soil in which the colorless, odorless gas of ideology takes root.
We actively seek out the gas because breathing it is effortless.
So we've established the psychological vulnerability. We know we are wired to prefer the comfortable shadows on the cave wall, to rely on system 1, and to crave cognitive ease.
Right.
But let's look at the supply chain. Who is casting the shadows? Who is manufacturing and pumping the gas into the room?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at how information has historically been controlled and distributed. And the sociologist, Professor Steve Fuller, uses a brilliant, almost Machiavellian framework for this.
The lions and the foxes.
Yes, he maps out the key players in our information architecture by dividing them into two distinct groups, the lions and the foxes.
Let's break those down. Who are the lions?
For a very long time, basically the entire 20th century, truth was a top-down enterprise strictly controlled by the lions. The lions represent traditional, established institutional authority.
So we're talking about expert institutions.
Yes. Legacy media, like the New York Times or the BBC. Government agencies like the CDC or the Federal Reserve. And established mainstream politicians.
The gatekeepers.
Exactly. In the broadcast era, the era of 3 major television networks and a few dominant national newspapers, the lions were the absolute gatekeepers. They decided what facts were allowed to emerge into public consciousness.
They provided the context.
They placed those facts in context, and ultimately, they decided what constituted the official historical record.
But wait, wasn't that actually a good thing in some ways? I mean, having a baseline of shared reality, even if it was flawed or incomplete, seems better than the absolute chaos of everyone having their own bespoke facts. The lions at least had fact-checkers and editorial standards, right?
That is the exact tension at the heart of this system. The lions provided societal stability and a shared narrative, which is essential for coordinating a large democracy. Yeah. But they also had massive blind spots. They frequently excluded marginalized voices, they protected institutional power, and they often buried uncomfortable truths that challenged their own authority.
So they built a very stable, well-lit cave.
But it was still a cave, and they entirely controlled the projector.
But then the internet happened. The gates were blown wide open. The projector was suddenly available to everyone.
Exactly. Enter the foxes.
The foxes.
The foxes represent the multitude of internet-driven, agile, decentralized sources of information. They are the independent podcasters, the viral social media accounts, the partisan bloggers, the populist commentators.
And what unites them?
The core unifying narrative of all the foxes is inherently anti-institutional. Their message is that the lions, the established elites, are corrupt, that they're intentionally hiding the truth from you, and that the official mainstream narrative is actually a mechanism of oppression.
So they thrive on agility.
Agility, skepticism, and offering alternative, highly engaging narratives that directly challenge the lion's monopoly on truth.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the line between lions and foxes isn't always drawn where you might intuitively think it is based on wealth or power.
No, it's not.
The underlying research points to Donald Trump as a fascinating, almost unprecedented structural paradox within the system.
A perfect case study.
Because by any traditional objective metric, Donald Trump is a quintessential lion. He is a billionaire real estate developer, a former president of the United States, deeply embedded in the financial establishment, and one of the most famous men on earth.
Yeah.
Yet his structural methodology, the way he navigates the information regime, is entirely that of a fox.
It is a remarkable systems-level hack.
Yeah.
He doesn't act like a lion defending the institution. He actively utilizes fox-like tactics to attack the very establishment architecture he belongs to.
He attacks legacy media as fake news.
He routinely muddies the waters of accepted, empirically verifiable facts, and he brilliantly weaponizes doubt. He uses the agility, the grievance, and the anti-establishment rhetoric of the Foxes to serve a partisan, populist agenda.
He's essentially acting as an insider, dismantling the lion's authority from a fox's posture.
Yes, and it works because it bypasses the traditional vetting mechanisms. By adopting the posture of a fox, a figure like that doesn't need the New York Times to validate his claims.
He just goes straight to the audience.
He speaks directly, via social media platforms, to the System 1 intuitions of a massive audience. He provides the cognitive ease of validating their grievances against the elites.
Which brings us to a massive systemic question regarding the incentives of this entire information architecture. Why do these simplified, often demonstrably false myths benefit the system?
Right.
Because in classical democratic theory, we are taught the marketplace of ideas. The theory goes that if you let all ideas compete, the truth will naturally rise to the top and win out because rational people will choose facts over fiction.
That's the Enlightenment ideal.
But why doesn't that happen?
That is the pivotal question. And the text points to a really sobering, honestly, almost depressing 2016 study by cognitive scientist Stephen Lewandowski to answer it.
Oh, this study is wild.
Yeah, it really is. In this study, Lewandowski took groups of voters, both Republicans and Democrats, and gave them lists of statements that had been made by prominent political figures.
Some true, some false.
Exactly. Some were demonstrably, empirically true, and some were demonstrably, undeniably false. The participants read the statements. Then, and this is the key part, the researchers explicitly intervened and told the participants which of the statements were false.
They didn't just tell them, they provided the concrete evidence proving they were untrue.
They gave them the objective facts, corrected the record entirely.
So, do you know what happened to the voting intentions of those participants after being shown undeniable proof that their preferred candidate was lying?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. It didn't change a single thing. Not a blip in the data.
Which fundamentally shatters our romantic notion of democracy as a rational exchange of ideas.
Yeah.
What Lewandowski concluded from this is that in our modern information regime, facts simply do not matter in the traditional objective sense.
They're just tools.
They are merely rhetorical tools. The actual incentive for a politician, a media operator, or a pundit isn't to impart objective truth or educate the public.
The incentive is to speak to a deeper, almost tribal, emotional level of truth.
It's about synthesizing complex realities with a top-down agenda that harmonizes with what the electorate feels ought to be true in their gut.
Yes. And the research highlights a brilliant quote from former U.S. Congressman Bob Inglis that perfectly captures this incentive structure.
The language of the tribe.
Exactly. Inglis said that to reach voters, you have to use the language of the tribe. You have to sound authentic. And in our current hyperpolarized populist climate, sounding authentic often means intentionally sounding unpolished, colloquial, or even aggressively uninformed.
It is a bizarre, completely inverted incentive structure.
Showing overt expertise is actually a massive political liability.
Think about the mechanics of that. If you're a politician and you sound too informed, too academic, too nuanced, or you use words with too many syllables, you sound like a lion.
You sound like the corrupt establishment.
You instantly alienate the Fox audience, who view nuance and complexity as a trick being played on them by the elites.
So the incentive is to perform authenticity over demonstrating substantive expertise. It's an act.
It's a performance.
And once this tribal language is established, once the cognitive ease is locked in, how does it spread? It scales through social contagion.
Right.
Because we have to remember that human beings are deeply, fundamentally social creatures. We evolved in small tribes where being ostracized meant death. Our beliefs are profoundly shaped by our social environment.
And the historian Yuval Noah Harari has written extensively about this phenomenon. He notes that people rarely appreciate their own ignorance because they lock themselves inside incredibly tight echo chambers of like-minded friends.
Which are reinforced by algorithmic, self-confirming news feeds.
Exactly. And Harari points out a critical, fatal flaw in the traditional rationalist approach to debate. If you bombard people with facts, charts, and data that clearly contradict their tribal narrative, it actually backfires.
This blew my mind when I first read it. Giving people the facts makes them more wrong.
Yes. It triggers a phenomenon known as identity protective cognition.
Identity protective cognition.
When you attack a person's core political belief with facts, their brain doesn't process it as an intellectual puzzle to be solved. It processes it as a literal threat to their identity and their social standing.
So they double down.
They entrench themselves further into the false belief to protect their sense of self.
Because giving up the belief means giving up the tribe. You lose your friends. You lose your community. The analysis pairs Harari's modern observation with a chillingly accurate quote from the novelist Leo Tolstoy.
Oh, the Tolstoy quote is perfect.
Tolstoy wrote that you can get accustomed to absolutely any condition, no matter how absurd or terrible, if you see everyone around you accepting it as normal.
Which gets to the core of reputational risk.
Think about Thanksgiving dinner. If all your friends, your entire family, and your whole online network vehemently believe a certain narrative, the social cost of standing up and rejecting that narrative is enormous.
You'll be mocked, exiled, canceled.
You subconsciously choose to believe what your group believes to maintain your status and your belonging. The cognitive ease we talked about earlier isn't just about internal mental comfort. It's about physical, social safety.
And when you have an entire society, an entire electorate, operating on these heuristics, relying on cognitive ease, adopting tribal language, and bowing to social conformity, the outcomes are highly predictable.
And frankly, dangerous.
Very dangerous. The system begins to produce incredibly distorted collective memories of massive, world-altering historical events.
Which brings us to the outcomes phase of our analysis. How do these dynamics warp reality on a macro scale?
Well, we need to introduce a concept coined by the Lebanese-American essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the narrative fallacy.
It's a narrative fallacy.
It describes our deep-seated biological vulnerability to compelling stories over raw, chaotic facts. When we look at a complex, multifaceted, random event in the past, our brains cannot tolerate the lack of order.
We hate chaos.
So we construct flimsy but highly coherent, linear accounts of what happened. We force a neat cinematic narrative arc onto randomness because our brains demand order and clear causality.
We need a villain, a hero, and a moral lesson.
Exactly.
And the ultimate devastating case study of the narrative fallacy in action, the primary example used to illustrate this entire system in the text, is the 2008 global financial crash.
It is the textbook example.
It really is. It shows how the information and ideology regime successfully rewrites reality in real time. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman actually refers to the prevailing public narrative surrounding the 2008 crash as the big lie.
So let's slow down and look at the actual mechanics of this specific narrative battle.
Okay, let's start with the empirical reality. The actual factual cause of the 2008 crash is widely understood and documented by macroeconomists globally.
It was precipitated by decades of deliberate Wall Street deregulation.
Right. It was fueled by the repeal of protective Depression-era legislation like the Glass-Steagall Act in the U.S.
It was driven by a massive systemic failure of banking oversight regarding incredibly complex, high-risk, exotic financial instruments.
Collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities.
Yes. It was fundamentally a catastrophic failure of the private financial sector, facilitated by a deliberate ideological political choice to remove regulatory guardrails because the market knows best.
That is the complex system to reality.
But that is not the story that survived in the public consciousness.
Because that story is too hard to explain on a bumper sticker. The prevailing right-wing and neoliberal myth that emerged from the wreckage and successfully took hold of the global political landscape reframed the cause entirely.
Masterfully shifted the blame.
Completely away from the banks, away from Wall Street greed, and away from deregulation. Instead, it pointed the finger directly at government profligacy and the poor.
The story that was pumped into the room was that liberal do-gooders and bloated government housing agencies forced innocent, well-meaning banks to give dubious subprime mortgages to low-income, predominantly minority home buyers who couldn't afford them.
And furthermore, that these activist governments had simply spent beyond their means, creating a sovereign debt crisis.
In the UK, the narrative successfully and almost entirely blamed the global crash on the supposedly reckless domestic spending of the incumbent Labour government.
And we must ask why this myth succeeded so spectacularly. Why did the public buy it when it was empirically false?
The answer brings us right back to everything we just discussed.
Cognitive ease.
Exactly. Think about it. The global financial system is unimaginably complex. Understanding how a credit default swap functions within the shadow banking system requires immense cognitive strain.
It requires hours of System 2 thinking.
And most people simply do not have the time, energy, or background to understand it.
But blaming a specific political opponent, blaming a supposedly bloated government bureaucracy, or blaming lazy borrowers who bought houses they couldn't afford.
That is cognitively effortless.
It requires absolutely no specialized knowledge. It fits perfectly into pre-existing tribal biases and the language of the foxes.
And here is the truly tragic outcome. The policy responses that followed the crash over the next decade, which included massive, no-strings-attached bailouts for the very banks that caused the crisis, followed by severe, punishing public austerity measures for the working class, they tracked the narrative fitness of this myth, rather than the empirical reality of the economics.
The story won out over the facts.
And millions of people suffered the economic consequences.
Which perfectly segues, well, actually, let me just present the specific frame they used to sell that austerity, because it is one of the most powerful, destructive, and brilliant cognitive frames of the last century.
The household budget illusion.
The household buddy illusion. After the 2008 crash, as governments across the globe were trying to justify slashing public services, cutting healthcare, and implementing severe austerity measures, they deployed a very specific analogy.
And George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist who studies how language dictates our political reality, highlights this beautifully.
The narrative pumped into the public consciousness through every media channel was that a sovereign nation's finances are exactly like a family's household budget.
The logic is elegantly simple, which is exactly why it's so dangerous. The pitch goes like this. If you, as a responsible family, have maxed out your credit cards, lost your job, and are drowning in debt, what do?
You tighten your belt.
You cancel the vacation, you cut your spending, you live within your means. Therefore, the argument goes, a nation in debt must do exactly the same thing. The government must tighten its belt and slash spending.
I mean, it makes total sense, right? It aligns perfectly with our everyday lived experience. If I spend more than I earn, I go bankrupt.
Exactly. It feels viscerally true. But from an analytical, macroeconomic perspective, this is a complete false consciousness.
It's a category error.
Of massive proportions. A sovereign state that issues its own fiat currency, like the US dollar or the British pound, is absolutely nothing like a household.
Because a household cannot legally print its own money to pay its debts.
But a sovereign state can. And a household spending does not form the income of other households in a closed loop. But a government spending is the national economy.
The government's deficit is, by accounting identity, the private sector's surplus.
When a government aggressively cuts its spending during a recession, which is what austerity is, it isn't acting responsibly. It is violently shrinking the economy, causing mass unemployment, and ironically, often making the national debt-to-GDP ratio mathematically worse because tax revenues collapse.
But, and this is the crucial systemic point, the household budget frame is overwhelmingly powerful because it is instantly, perfectly intuitive.
System 1 loves it.
It requires 0 calories to understand.
And once that cognitive frame is locked in place by the lions and the foxes, it becomes practically impossible for opposing politicians or economists to argue against it without sounding completely insane or irresponsible to the average voter.
Right. If a politician stands up at a debate and tries to explain the complexities of macroeconomic stimulus, fiat currency issuance, and sectoral balances,
they sound like an elitist lion using academic jargon to justify stealing your tax money.
they'd lose the audience in 30 seconds. The simple, false frame entirely dictates the boundary of acceptable political debate.
And this brings us to a really dark, almost dystopian reality.
The functional utility of anti-expertise.
Exactly. And what we now broadly call the post-truth era. Because if complex, empirical truths are too hard to explain, and simple, intuitive myths win elections and drive engagement, then expertise itself becomes the enemy.
The expert becomes a target.
And the research references a truly alarming study conducted by Stanford University to illustrate this. They tested 7,800 students ranging from middle school all the way up to the college level across 12 different states.
Digital natives.
Yes, the generation born with smartphones in their hands. The researchers wanted to see if they could distinguish fake, manipulative online news from real, verified journalism, or even tell the difference between a serious news article and a paid, sponsored advertisement.
And the results were not just bad, they were staggering.
The vast majority of these 7,800 students were completely fooled. They lacked the basic critical apparatus, the systemic literacy, to differentiate between credible, vetted information, and fabricated content explicitly designed to manipulate their emotions.
Which is terrifying on its face. But the analysis makes a much deeper, more profound point here about why this is happening. It argues that this post-truth vulnerability isn't just a failure of the education system to teach media literacy.
No, it's because post-truth actually feels highly functional to people day to day.
Think about it from the perspective of an ordinary citizen. You are working 2 jobs, raising kids, trying to pay the mortgage. You do not actually need to know the intricate, peer-reviewed facts of global trade policy.
Or the mechanisms of epidemiology, or the nuances of quantitative easing to go about your daily life.
Knowing the truth doesn't put food on the table.
What you do need, desperately, is a narrative that aligns you with your identity group. Believing the tribal myth, sharing the meme, repeating the slogan that keeps you socially safe.
It signals to your community that you are one of them.
It's a dark, bitter irony. We live in an age where we have mapped the human genome. We carry supercomputers in our pockets. We have landed rovers on Mars.
An age of peak, unprecedented scientific knowledge.
And yet our public policy and our shared reality are increasingly guided by untutored gut feelings, viral online myths, and algorithms optimizing for outrage.
Because, at the end of the day, the ancient evolutionary imperative for social belonging completely overrides the modern intellectual imperative for objective truth. You will choose the tribe over the truth almost every time.
Because historically, being right but alone meant you got eaten by a tiger.
Which leads us to a critical juncture in our analysis. We have mapped the design, the incentives, and the outcomes. We now have to ask how this incredibly flawed system manages to sustain itself through crises.
Right, so what does this all mean? Why doesn't the system break when it fails so spectacularly?
I mean, we all lived through the 2008 financial crash. Millions of people lost their homes, their pensions, their livelihoods. We all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, which brutally exposed massive, undeniable frailties in global supply chains, in the big economy, in public health infrastructure.
Why did these massive, undeniable reality checks not destroy the underlying free market fundamentalism?
Why does the story self-repair instead of shattering?
The answer lies in the concepts of sunk narrative costs, and what the Swedish sociologist Michael Klippman calls knowledge resistance.
Knowledge resistance.
These myths we've been discussing, whether it's the absolute infallibility of the free market or the inherent unavoidable inefficiency of government action, they are not just abstract philosophical ideas debated in faculty lounges.
They are load-bearing infrastructure for our society.
Entire political parties, massive financial institutions, global media conglomerates, and millions of individual identities have sunk immense, unrecoverable costs into these narratives. Their reputations, their careers, their wealth, and their very sense of self are built entirely on the premise that these myths are true.
It's like realizing halfway through your life that the foundation of your house is made of sand. But you've already built a 10-story mansion on top of it, and all your friends live there.
It's infinitely easier to just pretend the sand is concrete than to tear down the entire house and start over.
Exactly. The psychological and economic cost of admitting the system is fundamentally flawed is simply too high.
And to illustrate how deeply embedded this blindness is, the research cites the brilliant Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang.
Chang points out that we accept the legitimacy of the free market so completely
It is so much the odorless gas we breathe.
that we literally don't even see the massive complex web of aggressive state regulations that currently exist just to keep the market from collapsing.
Right. Give me an example of an invisible regulation.
Think about property rights or copyright laws, laws against child labor, bankruptcy protections, or the limited liability of corporations. We don't view these as massive government interventions that manipulate the market.
We view them as just the natural, organic state of the universe, the baseline reality.
We are completely blind to the immense state intervention that we like and rely upon, and we become hyper-fixated and outraged by the state intervention we don't like, framing that as an attack on the free market.
This systemic blindness is what allows the fundamentalist belief to survive empirical failure after empirical failure. If the market fails, the answer is always, it wasn't free enough.
And the text brings in the work of Nobel laureates George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, specifically their phenomenal book, Fishing for Fools.
They demonstrate, both mathematically and empirically, that unregulated free markets do not automatically tend toward a perfect optimal equilibrium that benefits everyone, which is the core neoliberal myth.
In reality, free markets actively, relentlessly reward manipulation and deception.
If there is a psychological vulnerability in the human brain, Like our reliance on System 1 and cognitive ease, the market will naturally efficiently produce an entity to exploit it for profit.
Whether it's a gambling app, an addictive social media algorithm, or a predatory subprime mortgage.
Yet, despite this empirical reality, the fundamentalist belief that unregulated markets are inherently optimal, rational, and self-correcting persists. It functions more like a religious creed, a theology, than an economic science.
It relies on faith.
And the regime survives through what you could call strategic ambiguity. It constantly shifts the goalposts.
Because to ask a citizen to independently dismantle the neoliberal myth or to abandon their tribal narrative is to ask them to dismantle their entire worldview and alienate their social circle. The psychological cost is simply unbearable.
So what happens? The system patches the cracks with a new coat of paint. They roll out a new catchy slogan. They find a new political scapegoat to blame for the structural failures, and the machine keeps moving.
Which raises an important question, and this takes us to the final phase of our analysis. Interconnection. How do these core myths, this ideology, ripple out into other nested systems within our society?
Because this ideology isn't contained just to Wall Street trading floors or political debate stages. It propagates, it leaks into everything.
It really does. It colonizes every aspect of human life. The research details this through the lens of commodification, referencing the political philosopher Michael Sandel.
Sandel has this brilliant, penetrating observation. Markets don't wag fingers.
These markets don't wag fingers, meaning what exactly?
By that he means the market is presented to us through the odorless gas of an entirely immoral, objective, scientific, neutral force, a force of nature like gravity. It doesn't judge you. It just efficiently allocates resources based on supply and demand.
And because we've passively accepted this myth of the market's perfect neutrality, we willingly allow market logic to colonize areas of human life that used to be governed by civic, ethical, or moral values.
We let the market into the sacred spaces.
Exactly. We see the ruthless logic of the market seep into the education system, into healthcare, into the prison system, into the environment.
We start treating students not as citizens to be educated, but as customers purchasing a degree.
We treat patients not as human beings needing care, but as revenue streams to be optimized for shareholders.
We privatize prisons and incentivize high incarceration rates.
And because we are viewing the world through the lens of market efficiency, we do all of this without triggering the moral defense mechanisms that should naturally arise when human beings are treated merely as commodities.
And the cascading systemic effect of this massive commodification is the gradual, inexorable destruction of social trust.
This is where the systems analysis truly comes together.
The text cites the extensive research of Eric Islander, who studies the correlation between economic structures and social cohesion. Islander's data shows a direct, undeniable mathematical link. High economic inequality, which is a highly predictable, mathematically certain feature of the neoliberal system we've described, directly correlates with the destruction of social trust.
Break that down. What does that mean on a street level?
As the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the working class widens into a chasm, trust in institutions plummets. But more importantly, trust in our fellow citizens plummets.
We stop viewing each other as neighbors engaged in a shared civic enterprise.
And we start viewing each other as ruthless competitors for scarce resources. Societies fragment. They break down into atomized, isolated individuals.
And from a systemic perspective, an atomized individual who trusts no one, who has no strong civic community, is infinitely easier to target and manipulate as a consumer by corporations.
And infinitely easier to manipulate as a voter by populist politicians using fear and outrage. Isolation is profitable.
Which brings us back to the ultimate stress test of these nested systems, the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, it was a massive, unprecedented system shock. The invisible infrastructure was suddenly visible.
Almost overnight, the free market fundamentalism was suspended because it simply couldn't handle a biological crisis.
Government stepped in with massive, rapid interventions. We saw multi-trillion-dollar furlough schemes, direct cash payments to citizens, eviction moratoriums, and public health mandates.
We saw a temporary but profound return to communal solidarity. People were checking on their elderly neighbors, clapping for essential workers, making sacrifices for the collective good.
For a brief moment, it empirically proved that the system could operate differently. The constraints were revealed to be choices.
The state could provide. The market could be paused.
But, and this is the tragedy of it, because the underlying narrative infrastructure, the TE home categories of the mind, the cognitive frames, wasn't replaced by a coherent new idea, the system couldn't change permanently.
The moment the immediate, acute biological threat receded, the system acted like a giant, tightly stretched rubber band. It snapped right back to business as usual.
The austerity rhetoric returned. The lions and the foxes resumed their positions and started arguing about who was to blame.
The colorless, odorless gas filled the room again, and we went back to sleep.
Because, as Holm would remind us, an idea can only be unseated by another idea. A crisis alone, no matter how severe, is not enough to change the system if there is no coherent, widely understood, and emotionally resonant alternative narrative ready to take its place.
Without a new story, the old shadows on the wall just flicker wildly for a moment during the crisis, and then they solidify right back into their familiar shapes.
So we've traced the entire architecture. We've looked at the design of this information regime, the cognitive vulnerabilities it exploits, the incentives that drive the lions and foxes, the predictable, sometimes disastrous real-world outcomes it produces, and its incredible, almost biological ability to persist and self-repair across all these nested systems of our society.
Which brings us to the core question of our show.
We have to ask it directly. What is the crisis in perception here?
The true crisis in perception is the profound, society-wide misperception of deep structural machinery as mere stories. We perceive our political and economic choices as free, rational, and independently derived, while remaining entirely blind to the incentive architecture and the layers of information control that prepackage those choices for us.
We think we are fiercely debating independent facts on a level playing field.
But we are actually debating within a rigid cognitive frame specifically designed to limit our options and preserve the status quo. Surface-level interpretations fail, like getting mad at a single politician or a single news network because they treat facts as independent variables.
They completely ignore the reality that ideology acts as the lens through which those facts are perceived, filtered, and given meaning.
The crisis is that we are trying to solve massive structural problems with flimsy narrative tools. Systems analysis restores visibility. It shifts our focus away from the outrage, the personalities, and the endless noise of the daily news cycle, and forces us to map the structural machinery, the lions, the foxes, the algorithms, and the cognitive heuristics that manufactures our shared reality.
It is about turning around in the cave and finally looking at the projector, rather than just endlessly arguing about the movie playing on the screen.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis today. We want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. If T.E. Holm is right, that we view the world through ideas rather than looking at them, what obvious, undeniable truth are you looking through right now that might actually be an engineered narrative? What shadow on the cave wall do you love so much? What shadow gives you so much cognitive ease that you would fight anyone trying to show you the fire?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.